Hi, welcome back. This is Arish from jtechnics.com and this is a video series on Android programming. In this video, we will have a look at basics of activity and intents. Activity is one of the main components of an Android app. Other main components are the service, the content providers, and broadcast receivers. Activity is the primary class for user interaction. Generally, we should implement a single and a focused task that a user can perform on the phone. Some examples of activity are composing an email, looking at a contact information, or a login screen, and many more. When you start an app, Android creates an activity and displays on the phone and puts that activity on top of a stack. This stack is called task BackStack. From the main activity, if you invoke another activity, say activity 2, this new activity is put on top of the stack. Again, if you invoke another activity from this second activity, the new activity is put on top of the stack. If a user closes an activity or he clicks on the back button on your phone, the top activity is removed from the stack and the next top activity is loaded onto the screen. Again, if user closes this activity or clicks on back button, the next activity in the stack is loaded onto the screen. Activity has a life cycle of its own. When Android creates an app or starts executing an app, it invokes the first activity and that activity is set in running state. At any given point, there will be only one activity that is currently running. If you invoke a new activity, then that running activity will go into a pause state, and from pause state it will go into a stopped state. When will the activity go into pause state? For example, if you have activity 1 and from this activity you display kind of alert or some window that does not take the complete screen of the phone, say only this much, then the activity behind this activity 1 is in pause state. It is visible but user cannot interact with that activity. On the other hand, if you click on a button to invoke a new activity and the new activity takes up the complete screen of the phone and the old activity is removed from the screen and that activity goes into stopped state. And when the activity is in either a stop state or pause state, Android could anytime destroy that activity to recover some resources if required. When Android kills that activity goes into destroyed state. So when activity is going through all this life cycle, Android invokes certain event or methods to let the activity know the change in the life cycle. So when the activity is getting created or when it's about to start running, Android invokes these 4 methods. In our Hello World program, we already looked at onCreate. Generally in onCreate, you need to get reference to your UI controls like button or the text view and set the content view. Then onStart is called, then onRestore instant state. Android sends a set of data as a bundle which you can restore if required. Then the onResume is invoked. Then if you invoke some other activity from our activity 1, the activity 1 goes from running on to paused. At that point on save instance state is called so that you get a chance to store any data that you are currently using in the activity. Then on paused method is called, and then the activity goes into paused, and from paused activity could go into stopped state. If the user clicks on the back button, the stopped activity will come back onto screen, that is, it comes back into running state, and it invokes on resume, on start and on restart. Note, it does not invoke on restore instance. This is invoked only when Android destroys your app, and when user clicks on the back button or he closes a new activity, that Android has to again recreate our activity to be displayed. Only then it comes back from starting to running. This is when it calls on restore to restore any data you may have. Let's look at a code example to understand activity lifecycle. I'll start creating an Android app called Activity Demo. I'll provide package name and reverse order of my domain, jtechnics.android. Click on next. I will name this activity as first activity. So in my activity I already have an onCreate method. To understand the lifecycle, let's print out some log statements on different events. To display a log, you can use a class called log dot. To display info, you can use a method called I. To display error, you can use E. To display warning, the W method. And if things go wrong, we can use a method called WTF, which means what a terrible failure. For our demo, we will use log.I to print out the info. For these methods, that takes two parameters. The first is the tag. It is a string. Say give a tag as first activity. Second is the message. I'll say in on create. Generally, it's a good idea to have this tag as a constant. I'll create a string called tag so that I can use the same tag in different methods. The use of tag is that when we looking at a log, we can filter it based on the tag. Let's import this log class. Next, we will create the method for onStart. You can type onStart and press Ctrl space in Eclipse to override that method. I will copy this log statement and paste it here and say on start. Similarly, I will do for on resume and log this as well. Then I will implement on stop. I log this as well. And lastly, we will invoke or implement on pause method and log it as on pause. So when our activity goes through this life cycle, we should be able to see these log statements in our logcat. Logcat is the logging tool that logs all the events that's happening in our emulator. So once we have our class ready, we can deploy this and test it. I already have my emulator running. So my Android app is being deployed. It will start in a while. So there is something called logcat. By default it shows all the messages, and you can see there is something called tag. You can filter the log to display only the log statements you are interested in. As you can see, we have some logs from our activity, first activity. You can add a filter, say my filter, and you can provide a tag first activity, so that we will view only our activities logs. As you can see, our activity started and it invoked onCreate, onStart and onResume. Now if I click on back button, it calls onPause and onStop. If I reopen my app, activity demo, it starts fresh and starts with onCreate, onStart and onResume. In our next demo, we will have a button here, and when you click on that, we will invoke a new activity, and we will look at how these lifecycle methods are called. To invoke or if to display a new activity, we need to understand something called intents. Intents are something that represent an event or an action. There are two types of intents: the explicit intent and implicit intent. Explicit intent is something where we will specify which activity to be invoked. For example, if I have a activity called activity 2, and it is in our own application, I mean it's the same class path, then I can specify to the intent that by saying that by specifying my current activity, this is the context, this is my first activity, and I can specify which class to load for my second activity. The syntax is here. First is the context, next we have the class name. When Android sees this intent, we specify the activity, then it loads the new activity, that is activity 2. There is another type of intent that's called implicit intent. Sometimes we may not know which activity call. For example, in your phone we will have a browser, and from our activity, if you want to invoke some URL, we would not know the activity name of the browser. So in that cases, we will create an intent with, and we'll provide some set of data. For example, I'll create an intent and say I want to browse some URL. At that point, we would not specify which activity to load. We only provide the intent, the action to be performed, and Android implicitly finds a particular activity and loads that activity. This process is called intent resolution. Sometimes there can be multiple activities which can perform same action. For example, there could be a default browser. For example, let's see, it's activity 3, and there could be another activity which can perform same set of actions. It can browse. At that point of time, Android displays a chooser saying there are two options available, you can pick any one, and user is allowed to pick any of the available option. So implicit means we only specify the intent and we do not specify the activity name, and Android picks the appropriate activity to load. So to specify the intent, we have several fields available. You can specify the action, the example like URL, or you provide a phone number and say dial this number, or you provide a data, for example geolocation, you provide a latitude or longitude and ask it to load a map. So Android automatically finds a activity which can load a map and passes data. Similarly, there are some categories like launcher, the main activity, and some set of data. We will look at implicit intents in detail in next video. As an example, to create an intent as an implicit, we first specify the action. This is action view, and we provide the data saying this is a URL. So Android will automatically find a activity which can load a URL, that is by default it will be a browser in our phone, and loads this URL. So let's look at implicit intent in detail in the next lecture. Let's look at a code demo for explicit intent. We will create one more activity called activity 2, and we will add a button in activity 1. When you click on this button, it loads the activity 2, and we will look at the ways to store the data inside our activity 1. When Android destroys our activity and recreates it, how we can restore this data. So generally, when we change the orientation of the phone from portrait to landscape, Android will destroy the activity and recreate the activity to display it in a different orientation. Let's go to Eclipse. We already have first activity. Let's create new activity class. I will create a new class, say second activity. The superclass should be the activity class. Finish. I need to first have a onCreate method to display the UI. I need to create a layout for this new activity. So for that I'll copy paste my older layout and make some modifications. I need to provide a name for this. I'll say activity second.xml. My new activity, I have a text and it's called allowed. Instead that I will use a title, say second activity text. I need to create this in my strings.xml. I'll copy paste one of them. I'll say this is second activity. So I have a text called this is second activity. I will go to secondactivity.java and set the content view to load this. Set content view dot layout dot activity second. So we have second activity ready. So we'll go to first activity and we will add a button to invoke the second activity. My graphical layout, I will pick a button and place it somewhere here, and I'll provide ID to this start activity button. This is the ID of our button. The text we should put it in a strings class XML. I will copy paste this. I'll say start activity button. I'll press start second activity. This is a label of our button. So instead of a hard-coded text, I will say string slash start activity button. So if I look at the graphic layout, it says start second. So next we will create a on-click listener for this button, and we will open our second activity from there. For that, we go to first activity, and on create method we will get reference to this button that we can do using method called find view by id. Why we can use find view by id is because our button is a subclass of our view class. So you need to provide an id. It's r.id.start activity button. Since this method returns a view, we need to typecast it to use button. So once we have reference to this button, we can set on click listener. For that, my button dot set on click listener method. For this we need to pass a object which implements an interface called on click listener. Instead of creating a new class, we can create an anonymous class here. Say new. We can use button dot on click listener, and we need to implement a method called on click. In this on click, we can start our new activity, that is our second activity. To do that, we need to first create an intent. I will say intent, my intent equals to new intent, and we will use the constructor for explicit intent. The first is the context, that is reference to our current activity, that is our first activity. I can say first activity dot this. The second parameter is the class name of the activity that we need to load, that is second activity dot class. The next we can use a method called start activity and pass the intent object. So first we create an intent object, then we call start activity method to invoke our intent and display our second activity. Let's now deploy this. Right click, run as Android application. Android is deploying my app. You can see it's saying launching activity demo. So once it deploys, it automatically starts my activity. So I can see this is my first activity and I have a button called start second activity. When I click on this, we can see our lifecycle methods printing out some statements. As of now, there are 3 log statements: on create, on start, and on resume. We have these statements only in our first activity. So I'll click on this button, and there is an exception. So let's figure out what's the problem. It says unable to find explicit activity Android activity demo second activity. Let's see. Alright, so although we have created our Android our second activity, but we did not define this as activity. As of now, this is just a Java class. To define this as a activity, we need to go to Android manifest XML file, and we inside the application tag we need to define our activity. As you see, we already have one activity, this first activity. Similarly, we need to define our second activity. For that, I will create an activity tag and provide the Android :name. This is the name of our activity along with the package. Say jtechnics.android.activity_demo. This is a package name, and my activity class is called second activity. Another attribute we need to pass is a label. Label is the title of our activity. For that, we can either hardcode here, say second activity, or the best thing is to put it in strings.xml. I will say second activity label. I need to define the second activity in my strings.xml. Second activity. So now we have defined our activity in our Android manifest file. Now we should be able to deploy it and test it. Our Eclipse is launching our activity demo app. When it is loaded, it will automatically run our app. Okay. So let's click on the button and see what it displays in the log. As you can see, second activity is loaded, and on the first activity it called onPause and onStop. In our BackStack, now on top of the stack second activity will be there, and below that the first activity. So if user clicks on the back button, say here, it resumes our first activity and invokes onStart and onResume. Next, let's look at storing some data within our first activity and see how to restore and save the data when Android destroys and recreates our activity. Say I want to keep a increment of a button or increment of some action. For that, let's say I will add another button here, and I will name it as increment button. Say increment. This should be in a string XML. Say increment. Go to strings and create a string called increment. So when I click on this increment button, I will have a value incrementing here on the text. For that, default text for this view, I'll make it as says allowed, so I'll make it as 0. To maintain the data, I will create a variable in my first activity called int value equals to 0. So I'll get reference to my other button, that is increment button. Find view by ID r.id.increment button. And when I click listener, increment button dot set on click listener new button dot on click listener and I will implement this method on click. Here I will just increment my value. And after incrementing, I need to display the incremented value on in this text view. So I need to get reference to my text view as well. So text view display text equals text view find view by ID. I need to first specify ID for this. Say Android ID equals at plus means create a new ID. So I will say display text r.id dot display text. I'll import text view. So when I increment my value, I will set increment a value and display it in the text. Set text value. So since I'm referencing this inside another class, I need to make sure this is available outside of our class. And this should be final since I'm invoking it inside a inner class. Required. So I'm setting the text here. So let's look at the demo. It takes a while. I think I clicked on some link. When it starts, it was completes, it will immediately start our activity. So currently there is 0, so I will just click increment. There is an exception. This exception, the package identifier not found. Reference number for some particular resource. We'll go to r.java. See what the 0001. Let's look at our code. Alright, the set text takes in a value of string and we are providing an int value. So to make it easier, we'll say value is and then print the value. Let's deploy and test this. So this is loaded. When I click on increment, it increments the value and displays the value in the text. The point is that if I change the orientation of my phone from portrait to landscape, on an emulator I can do it using a keyboard shortcut Ctrl F12. When I change the orientation, Android will destroy the activity and recreate the activity. As you can see, the value has gone back to 0, and you can see in the log that it has called onCreate method again and gone through all of this start and resume methods. So when this happens, when user changes the orientation from vertical to horizontal, You need to be able to restore this data. To do that, we need to use two methods. The one to store data is on save instance state. So this is called by Android when our activity is going to be paused or stopped. It passes a object called bundle. After a bundle, this is similar to hash map, and whatever data you need to save, you can put it inside this bundle. I have value to be put. I will say on state dot put int. Since I'm putting an integer, you need to provide a key for this. Say my count and passing the value variable. So when the Android is stopping my activity, it will store my data into this bundle, and when it recreates it, so when it recreates it, will pass back this data in the method on restore. It passes the saved data. I can get this back into my variable called value dot get int. The key is my count. This is a key I provided when saving it. So once I get this data, I can display it back in my text by using display text set text. This way, even when Android destroys and recreates my activity, I can still retain the data, the state of my activity. Let's deploy and test it. I'll clear the log. Eclipse is launching my app. When it's installed, it will automatically start my app. So I will increment this few times, and I will press Ctrl F12 to change the orientation. So you can see Android is destroying my activity and recreating it from the log. And on the phone, you can see the value is again retained. I can still increment it several times. Again, I will press Ctrl F12 to change the orientation of the phone. Android recreates my activity. My value is still retained. To recap, in today's lecture, we looked at life cycle of the activity, and we looked at how to log things when these events are invoked on start, on resume, on stop, and several methods. And then we created another activity called second activity, and we defined the second activity as an activity inside Android manifest. And from our first activity, we added a button to invoke second activity, and on click of the button we created an intent, and then we started the activity. To demonstrate the way we can restore and save and restore our data specific to our activity, we added a simple UI element called increment a particular value, so dynamically change the value. And we looked at how to use on save instance state and on restore instance state to store and retrieve our data specific to our activity. Thank you for watching. For more video tutorials, please visit jtechniques.com.